For this weekend's shipwreck video, we'll be looking at one of the most famous shipwrecks in history. A story that gripped the news the world over 25 years ago. It was almost impossible to ignore if you watched the news covering it, or the many documentaries on the topic as people tried to make sense of the tragedy. That shipwreck was Kursk, a Russian cruise missile submarine. Her sinking captured the imagination of the world, as did the salvage of the boat, with most of the submarine's massive hulk pulled from the bottom. It's that salvage and scrapping that we'll be focusing on today, for the most part, along with an overview of the sinking itself. For that, it's important to note that Kursk was functionally brand new when the submarine sank. This wasn't a case of some broken down old boat having an unfortunate accident. In a way, that's part of what makes this sinking as surprising as it was. Kursk had only been laid down in 1990, with the boat launched and commissioned in 1994, with the commissioning itself coming at the very end of the year, on December 30th, 1994. What this means in practical terms is that Kursk was only 5 years old when she sank. For a nuclear submarine, that might as well be brand new. Those often last 30 or even 40 years in service. Take, for example, the Ohio class, where the oldest are pushing 40. Kursk's own sister ships are over 30 years old at this point. So you had what was functionally a new submarine when Kursk set sail in August of 2000 for a major fleet exercise. The Summer X naval exercise, the first large-scale operation since the fall of the Soviet Union. During the exercise, Kursk was setting up for a torpedo training launch. I've seen it variously described as targeting the carrier Kuznetsov or the missile cruiser Pyotr Veliki. Regardless of which capital ship Kursk was supposed to stalk, there were some issues in the process, with Kursk asking for permission to do the test around 8:50 in the morning. She wouldn't set up the run until around 11:30, when the crew loaded a practice load into one of the boat's torpedo tubes. This consisted of a Type 65 torpedo without its warhead. For the test, Kursk was going to load 2 of those torpedoes. Unfortunately, it was during this process that the accident happened. Just before 11:30, the first explosion rang out. And soon after, a second, much larger explosion was detected. Most sources will cite the official explanation here, that the first explosion came from high-test peroxide used for fuel. This leaked from cracks in the practice load's casing, in turn causing a detonation of the kerosene fuel tank. More critically, it set off a massive fire that would, in turn, detonate several torpedoes. This was the larger explosion that doomed the submarine, at least by the official reports. Various Russian sources would argue for a collision with USS Toledo starting the issue, while a later documentary, and I use that word very loosely here, argued for both the collision and USS Memphis firing a torpedo at Kursk. With this getting into conspiracy theory territory, the official explanation is by far the more likely. Regardless, these 2 explosions would send Kursk to the bottom. Most of the crew was lost in the initial accident, as fire and flooding raced through the forward compartments. However, 23 of the crew were able to survive in the stern sections, making their way to the very aft end of their boat. Exactly how long those men survived isn't entirely clear. They were alive for at least a few hours, based on a note written by one of them. Unfortunately, those men would not survive to be rescued. Kursk used an emergency chemical oxygen generator. This would absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen. It's likely the crew attempted to change cartridges out of this system, with those cartridges being incredibly volatile if exposed to water, which is most likely what happened. This would have caused a flash fire, and any men who survived that fire, likely by diving beneath water, would have been suffocated, because the fire burnt out whatever oxygen was left in the compartment. As a result, the entire crew would be lost. In all, that was 118 men. It's unfortunate that none of the crew could use the escape capsule like on Komsomolets. However, anyone that far forward toward the bow was likely lost in the explosions. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of the sinking, it became something of a controversy, from a slow response to a refusal to accept foreign assistance. However, that's too meaty of a topic to dig into here. I would be happy to do a follow-up video on that mess on a later date. In any case, once it was clear none of the crew survived, salvage work could begin. 2 Dutch companies were hired to raise most of Kursk's hulk. The heavily damaged bow would be cut off out of concern about the remaining torpedoes. This was done with one mounted to a massive saw that slowly cut the bow section away, while the rest of Kursk, from just ahead of the sail or the conning tower to the stern, would be raised. This came on October 8, 2001, with the remnants of the boat dry docked in Murmansk. As for the remaining bow section, this was destroyed by explosives in 2002. Right, that's a longer starting section than normal, but I wanted to give this story its due. Now we can move to the wreck itself. The first thing you'll notice about that wreck, aside from the missing bow, is the sheer scale. Kursk was 154 meters, 505 feet long, and had a beam of 18.2 meters, or 60 feet. Even with the front third or so chopped off, that is still a very large boat. Looking at her in dry dock like this, I'll admit that's not immediately apparent. She looks large, yes, especially when looking at the tubes for the anti-ship missiles here. But you don't get a good sense of scale. Big, yes, but not exactly how big. For that, you need to see the boat with a human scale figure to compare to, such as, for example, in the next couple pictures. Here we have Kursk early after the salvage, before the twisted metal had been cleared away. It goes a long way to demonstrate how she really was quite literally sawed in two, looking at how twisted the cut is. But it also demonstrates the scale. We've got a couple figures here examining the fire-blasted interior, and they look quite small in comparison to the hull, both the broken and intact parts. Admittedly, it is not quite as notable as this similar image from the salvage of Tirpitz, but the same general point remains. Having a human in frame shows the scale of these wrecks far better. That aside, the other notable part here is the debris. Most images you'll see of the wreck are after they cleared this out. The first one in this video, for example, shows a clear bulkhead on the interior with no debris, along with a much cleaner cut on the bow. Not so here, where the investigation is still ongoing. This image from inside the wreck shows that even better. Men are working inside the gaping hole torn in the sub to clear out the debris. Lights were rigged up to illuminate the interior as that grisly task went on. It was this work that found a lot of fire damage, supporting the official explanation. And as you can see, a lot of general debris as well. Clearing out the bow was not an easy or clean job. And that's not even touching on the wiring that you can see in piles in the next image. I can only imagine how much of that tangled mess had to be cut away to get through the hull. Between cutting open bulkheads, removing damaged material, and the cabling, that can't have been easy for the men who were assigned that duty. And that's ignoring the bodies that had to be removed, or at least what was left of them. Only 3 of the crew weren't found, while the rest were pulled from the wreck, which, between the fires, explosions, and the water, definitely was not a pretty sight. Thankfully, there's no bodies in this image, just that tangle of wires and debris, and more demonstration of the scale of the wreck with these workers higher up here. Meanwhile, the last interior image is from much closer in. This area, wherever it is very rough. The side looks burnt, and the wiring is still present, as well as more damage in the center frame. Along with this hatch. Exactly what the hatch led to, I'm not sure. There's not enough context here to judge where exactly this picture was taken in the hull. On the other hand, the hatch is clearly shut, so we can't see inside it. The metal around it, and to some extent the hatch itself, also looks scorched. At the same time, however, I'm not going to rule out that being mud and water damage, because the image quality is not the greatest. Regardless, that rounds off the interior pictures. Now we can return to the exterior after much of the debris had been cleared away, leaving an empty shell where the bow used to be, along with much of the exterior plating removed from ahead of the sail. This has exposed 4 of the missile tubes, 2 on either side of the hull. Kursk carried 24 of these tubes, with 12 on either side of the boat. Each tube carried a single P-700 Granite missile, the most powerful anti-ship missile that the Soviets deployed. Only the Oscar-class submarines, like Kursk, the Kirov-class cruisers, and Admiral Kuznetsov, carried these powerful weapons. And large weapons for that matter, which is why the tubes are angled. You can see that on the tubes here, but you can see it better later on in this image when much of the hull plating had already been removed. The tubes were angled to allow for easier launching of the missiles. The angled tubes required less force than a straight-up launch, as well as requiring a relatively smaller hull. In any case, as we can see here, those are largely intact. The explosion on Kursk didn't reach the missiles, and it didn't set any off. If it had, well, I doubt there would have been much left of the sub. As it was, the tubes were intact, and the missiles themselves were removed during the salvage. You can see one of the tubes without its hatch at the back here. As for the rest of the boat, well, aside from the missing bow, this was mostly intact, from the sail or conning tower all the way back to the stern. You can see that in this image. There's no notable damage beyond where she was cut in two, not on the sail or the hull, just the open tubes for the missiles. Without much else to note here, as it's broadly similar to other pictures, let's move on to the last two. First, a rare look from the stern of the wreck. Most pictures of Kursk are from the bow looking aft. This is the reverse, the stern looking forward. There's still not much to note, mind you. The dive plane on this side has been removed, and holes have been cut above the shafts. but as the stern was largely undamaged, there's not much to touch on here, other than this being another good example of how large the boat was. Even missing a good chunk of the bow, looking forward shows this pretty well. And if you're curious on scale, well, we have this image of an Oscar in dry dock. Shows pretty well how big these boats are. That said, we've reached the end of the video, with one final image, and the one that seems to fuel the "was torpedoed by an American submarine" conspiracy theory. A hole in the side just behind where the bow was cut away. People will argue that's too neat a hole to be anything but a torpedo impact, and that it's what sank the sub. That's not really the case. You'll note that's right next to one of the missile tubes, and we saw no sign of that kind of damage on those earlier. And just for comparison, here's an example of torpedo damage from USS Saratoga. While a Japanese torpedo from World War II is not a Mark 48, well, this is what torpedo damage looks like. The apparent hole on Kursk is far too small. Moreover, it's well past the actual bow damage. But, well, conspiracy theorists. In any event, that brings us to the end of the video. Kursk was a tragedy, make no mistake. And regardless of your feelings on modern Russia, those 118 men certainly didn't deserve to suffer such a terrible end. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.